I recently just did a video on Orochimaru versus the Kage Summit, where I placed the Serpent Sannin in his successor Sasuke's place to demonstrate how underrated the Sannin remain, even at higher points in the series. And well, as a follow-up to that, I figured why not place Jiraiya in Sasuke's position to see if he would do better or worse than Orochimaru. So yeah, this video is a follow-up video to that, and I guess Sage Naruto versus the Kage Summit as well, so some points particularly from the Orochimaru rendition will be repeated here if necessary, such as when discussing the overall caliber of the Sannin, which I suppose we could begin with, as well as encompassing Jiraiya's lore to see the power ground he enters the fight at. And like Orochimaru, he does enter on some solid footing, seeing as he is quite relative to Orochimaru, despite a common consensus being that Orochimaru is vastly superior, which just isn't the case. Even when Hiruzen is unconfident in the idea of anybody in Konoha being able to beat Orochimaru in a fight, Ebisu, Hiruzen's assistant, notes how Jiraiya being there, he probably could be a match for Orochimaru, seeing as it takes a Sannin to fight another Sannin according to him, which is something the first data book would also corroborate by stating that Jiraiya is a powerful shinobi on par with Orochimaru, basically meaning that they are strong matches for one another, which, well, is something Pain doesn't seem to disagree with as well, as he does compare the two, stating, well, whether it's Jiraiya or Orochimaru, each of the prodigal three have unique powers, again implying there's, some way that the two are very much similar in power level, capable of giving the other a very tough battle. However, even with this, many might point to Orochimaru edging him out in things like ninjutsu through their encounter in the three-way deadlock, stating how it's no contest between them and who's stronger, or that Jiraiya is simply outmatched, which might be fine, but I would like to note that it's still that they are of a caliber similar enough to give one another a close fight, which is what's important. Orochimaru, when not being so boastful, pushes this idea in some sense through him implying that Jiraiya's sealing jutsu is on par with both Hiruzen's and his own. This may hold more validity when accounting for Jiraiya's data book, how he notes how he wants to fight Hiruzen, implying that he's actually confident in winning, or at least, performing well in such a high level battle like the one with Orochimaru, which was implied to be, by the, bystanding Anbu to be like a Hokage level battle, implying that Hiruzen is still living up to his reputation as the strongest of the 5 principal territories as stated by Kabuto, which does get supported 3 other times in the fan book. One that's actually kind of just implying that Hiruzen is at the peak, of the shinobi world and whatnot through like his masterful ninjutsu, whereas the other two kind of just imply that like the Hokage tier is the strongest of the village, or of all the villages, I guess, likely on the basis of Hiruzen's power, which is, a power likely not out of Jiraiya's range, seeing as, well, he's not only implied to be a match for, Orochimaru and Hiruzen, but also he was chosen to replace Hiruzen and take the mantle as Hokage, the strongest leader, twice over Kakashi, Konoha's strongest jonin, as stated in both the first fan book and first data book. And while, yes, the gap in missions being nearly 700 and experience at large do play a role, it's not likely a role greater than the power gap, seeing as Orochimaru's terrifying Kakashi so bad that Kakashi can only picture his head being sliced off, where he would then, preemptively activate his Raikiri prior to revealing the Sharingan, showing just how disturbed he actually was. The Naruto Storm Generations game has a cutscene showing base Jiraiya beating up Rasen, Shirk, and Naruto following the Kakuzu fight without even getting a scratch on him. And well, seeing as Kakashi seemed to believe that Naruto was a match for him, this could kind of supplement that more if you do take the games as authoritative. You could also just say that Itachi didn't cripple Jiraiya like he did Kakashi, despite Kisame implying he could have, simply because, well, Jiraiya was a much greater and more powerful asset to Konoha than Kakashi, implying that Jiraiya is certainly a match for the Hokage title, which, if you accept some statements from earlier, then it would fit quite nicely. Orochimaru is again stated to be evenly matched against Hiruzen, again supporting the entire narrative of Jiraiya being close to Orochimaru in true strength, which is, well, something the second data book credits to Jiraiya's Spartan training, being what allows him to remain a fighter capable of battling Orochimaru despite his vast and ever-expanding arsenal of forbidden jutsu, which would be matched by Jiraiya's sheer physical strength through, well, training. However, regardless of your interpretation on them being on par with one another, Jiraiya at least equals to or above Orochimaru in his Sage mode, as upon entering the lower form, he implied that he transcends his Sannin level to become a Hermit Sage, which is probably just consistent seeing as Jiraiya was able to harden his resolve and totally blitz the human path, who was likely holding back in accordance to Jiraiya's, level and base or whatnot, implying that the Sage mode is massively above that, which shouldn't come to a surprise to anyone, as, well, yes, Jiraiya is an incomplete Sage, he's still one of the best ever better at it, as implied by Fukasaku when envisioning the initial Sage form of Jiraiya, not the stronger one we see later, that kind of develops the full face coverage for the Sage mode along with his frog-like features that he dons, likely due to having more Sage, mode and whatnot, having more Senjutsu buildup, whatnot, which would equate to a serious boost in ninjutsu, genjutsu, and taijutsu, as implied by Fukasaku when educating Naruto. So, even in his lower form, Jiraiya is one of the best Sage mode users ever, and is either equals to or above Orochimaru, where he then goes on to get stronger and fight the paths on solid footing, and yes, if not aided by hard scoping shared vision, he is stated to be on the road to victory as shown against the Animal Path, who did block his fastest Sage attack previously, but that would just be due to the Preta Path utilizing the Rinnegan sensory through the dilation of the pupils, while staring at Jiraiya from a far distance as he took the Animal Path's back. So, while it is made clear that Pain is superior to Sage Jiraiya, it's equally clear that Jiraiya did perform well in that fight despite not being able to fully utilize his full arsenal and ninjutsu that he learned from his time at Mount Miyaboku. Such jutsu are stated in the 10-year anniversary guide to actually make the shinobi from other nations tremble tremendously since the great times of war. This would likely include his various, toad-related jutsu, such as this toad esophagus that he placed both Itachi and Kisame under, that would be implied to force Itachi to utilize his Mangekyo, implying that his basic fire style, which is stated to be the hottest of all fire style in the world, simply couldn't break through it. This statement also probably encapsulates many of these summons as well, like, Mr. Gamakin, who's able to weave the Animal Path summons through the towers to buy Jiraiya time. Gambabunto stated to be the strongest and largest of the toads, and most importantly, Ma and Pa, who are basically the strongest asset as they can be summoned and allow for him to enter Sage mode much more proficiently, enable greater combo attacks through their autonomous high-level ninjutsu, like Ma's tongue and acid that wrapped around the chameleon, for Pa to then use his high-pressure water style to blast straight through it. And the two also possess the Frog Song, which is a demonic illusion stated to be the strongest genjutsu, implying it's even stronger than the infamous Tsukiyomi that's only feared to be the strongest. Jiraiya's arsenal also boasts a wide array of really dangerous fire-style ninjutsu, like his flame bombs, which can also be coupled with the toad oil to cover absurd amounts of ground. This would be a, summit strategy potentially for him to literally just cover all the ground, the entire room in oil, then ignite it, and then just kind of slip through the walls in Sage mode like he did in the Pain fight, which is something interesting and not many, people really know Jiraiya can do, as he could also use this to capitalize on many other powerful jutsu. He could potentially learn that, Mount Miyaboku being like maybe his flaming Rasengan, which never did appear in the manga, but it was a very promising concept for the Naruto Storm games, and more importantly, the manga's 10-year anniversary guide, which does display it in both his file and Orochimaru's file. However, I want to reiterate that it's not Jiraiya's vast and powerful collection of Sage Jutsu, fire style, and summons that make him so deadly, but his resilient, Spartan-like physical prowess on the level of the Hokage, and likely above Orochimaru by this point, as it will be his Sage mode for the form we use in the summit. However, even in base, like Orochimaru, he has many tactics of circumventing life-threatening attacks, like how Orochimaru reattached his organs after being sliced in half by the Four Tails Naruto. However, Jiraiya showed his stupid physical resilience in this fight with the Four Tails as well, where he did just as good as Orochimaru. And I hear you, crowd sounds like I'm an 80 TV show, I know, I hear you, but what I mean is, when revisiting the Four Tails fight, we get two primary images in the manga, being one from Naruto and one from Jiraiya, both of which show Jiraiya with a massive injury on his chest laying against some debris. However, the backgrounds to both panels are different, implying that he didn't just get up from this injury and fight Four Tails Naruto once, but twice. So this is a pretty cool idea that I've never really heard brought up, where he still gets up, and manages to seal him away and win the battle, whereas Orochimaru would have lost in that fight if it went on any longer, seeing as his body was about to literally give out. And the common criticism to my claim would be how, well, Orochimaru was faced with greater threats such as Bijou bombs, and I would argue, well, that's fine, as Jiraiya could have faced one as well, seeing as in this flashback panel his mouth is smoking, and that only happened when he ate the Bijou bomb and blasted it back out. And well, regardless, Jiraiya was able to still hold back to some degree and retighten the seal whilst in base, where Orochimaru simply lost due to his form as well, which could allude more to their relativity base to base, where Orochimaru's superior ninjutsu is a match for Jiraiya's sheer physical strength and resilience. And even in the Pain fight, after lowering his senjutsu, Jiraiya's arm gets gets ripped off, where he's still more than capable of pulling one of the paths into his Toad dimension whilst all 6 were jumping him at the same time, and the anime extends this to Jiraiya's favor, showing him parrying them all off briefly. However, I digress. Just some pretty impressive higher ends for Jiraiya, which could also be a strategy employed here, where if forced with a difficult opponent or multiple, he could simply pull one or the greatest threat into a separate dimension to then fight him like he did with the Pains. And while we've already established that Jiraiya is above the individual paths, it should still be noted that he was capable of pulling this strategy off in a weaker Sage mode with his arm missing against these 6 paths who, as a group, collectively and whatnot, are probably just above the 5 Kage. But I suppose we can now kind of lean back into that, with our first rounds being against the Raikage and his guards, Darui and C. Entering the first room, we are met with probably one of the most contentious Kages, being the Raikage A and his guards C and Darui, who are implied to be near the higher tier of Jonin and Kumo, since we know that Darui possesses the Mark of the Third, indicating his ability to utilize Black Lightning, which is probably a notorious style, seen as Kinkaku and Genkaku, the 2 worst criminals in Kumo history, believed that they were going to get a good fight simply based on him having it, where Darui would do exactly that, beating them up and taking advantage of his powerful jutsu and physicality. Kinkaku was actually a threat implied by the Raikage to be a threat he needed to deal with himself based upon their reputation, but Darui dealt with him rather easily, which could also just highlight the true relativity between A and Darui, and we do know that Darui is capable of combo attacking with the version 1 Raikage, at least prior to him getting more serious due to the anger as implied by the weekly release statement. He was also able to battle pretty defensively against Suigetsu, who is formidable in some sense, and though he's below the other, formidable Kumo shinobi like Killer Bee, the 8-Tails Jinchuriki, it's still a testament to Darui being a right-hand man to the Raikage per se, being able to kind of help the Raikage and assist him in combat. The pitfall to this, though, would be how Jiraiya simply transcends this due to him being stronger than Kakashi whilst in base. Almost every median implies that Konoha is the strongest nation, which would just mean that, the highest Jonin of Konoha, whose reputation stretched to both the Raikage and Darui, would probably transcend one of these stronger Jonin and Kumo, and Kumo and whatnot. However, I wouldn't even say that Jiraiya himself is necessary for this run to the battle, seeing as he had, in his highest Sage Mode form, he does have Ma and Pa, who Jiraiya considers himself a novice in comparison to, and particularly Pa, is also just capable of sparring with Sage Mode Naruto, who stated to be even more powerful than his fallen sensei Jiraiya on the back of Volume 45, and while they obviously wouldn't be able to beat Sage Naruto up in a fight or anything like that, they are still, formidable enough to kind of keep up with him in some sense, and this should also just put into perspective why Pain was so shocked at the haste of their combo attacks, and the same would probably just apply here. Ma and Pa would likely use combinations to beat them up while Jiraiya battles the Raikage, and the reason I'm sort of writing C off as a non-factor in this case would be, well, he almost is, in the sense that, well, he's not really a combative type shinobi and is in the sensor unit for the war, which Darui supplements back in the summit with him ordering C to hunt for Sasuke's companions, as well, he isn't really needed on the battle side of things. His style of battle also kind of reflects this as well, as it's also just all relying on Genjutsu and Sensory, which Ma and Pa are both masters of on a much higher level than C, whose Flash Pillar is used by a common technique, whereas, Ma and Pa, they have like the strongest Genjutsu, dominant since the Sage of Six Paths era, so you guys can see where I'm going. A strategy you could also pull off quite earlier would be one of the 2 I mentioned earlier, the first of the which would be how he could just mud swamp the entire room, as he's able to engulf Orochimaru's giant snake's hole, whilst implying it's not even near the full size. This would allow for him to have a massive terrain advantage, where he can not only then summon more toads easier through the, to aid in more time allowed to him, that would also just halt C and Darui to give Ma and Pa an easier time, but the other strategy would also just be like if the Raikage, who starts in version 1, in light of Sage Jiraiya's powers, ups his cloak to V2, where Jiraiya would then obviously begin to have trouble, potentially forcing the incentive to pull him into the Toad dimension that he fought the Paths of Pain in. And he's also just able to utilize Ma and Pa in this strategy, as it's also just, they're kind of with him. Either strategy is fine, as they basically lead to just like an increasing Raikage versus Sage Jiraiya with Ma and Pa at the same time, which version 2 Raikage by this point, prior to getting stronger in the war, is still a beast, being able to beat up MS Sasuke and totally outspeed him in his brutal taijutsu and pro wrestling moves. A point I brought up in the Orochimaru video was how in the second fan book, Kishimoto spends a considerable amount of time explaining his thoughts thoughts and process in narrative decisions and character designs, where, in explaining the Raikage, he hinted at the idea that the Raikage was lacking in proficiency, at least in hand-to-hand combat scuffles, but being very dominant in grappling-focused taijutsu, where he would then use his, pro wrestling style to win battles. And I mean, bro does have a golden championship wrestling belt around his waist, so you know what I'm saying? So while I would say that Jiraiya would be able to do extremely well against the Raikage, where he could do, keep his distance through like the usual style of long-range ninjutsu, however, in this case, the Raikage is able to dodge Sasuke's Amaterasu that's implied to be the peak of the peak, so it's not like Jiraiya's flame bombs are just going to be blasted him in the face, which would also just force Jiraiya into a similar situation that he had against Pain, where he had to rely on his, extreme power and amped up Sage Mode to deal blows with Rasengans, among other things. And while I think he could eventually catch the Raikage due to his Sage Mode sensory being, in a higher state and his speed being of A's caliber, it's not like he would just be able to, capitalize on his fastest Sage Jutsu being the Kabari Senbon, as they probably wouldn't even be able to pierce the cloak like with the Kusanagi blade. Now, I could still see how some might be skeptical of my claim that Jiraiya being able to eventually catch A, but we are talking about a character whose skills above Old Man Heroes, and likely by a marginal degree, who is simply above the Five Kage, standing at the peak of the shinobi world, which will place him above A, and more importantly, he was also just able to catch Pain, potentially the strongest man in the Akatsuki, who was considered to be invincible to those who could oppose him. Even Obito was surprised at the, and kind of mocked Pain at the extent of how far he was pushed by Jiraiya, who must have lived up to his reputation, which is obviously quite ridiculous, even if you want to be conservative and say that the second fanbook comparing the Hokage and Sannin is simply reputation. It wouldn't matter, as Jiraiya scales to this, at least in Sage Mode. So, things like a surprise Rasengan, flaming Rasengan, or even his stronger attacks like the big ball Rasengan should just catch A lacking at some point, or at least press him to the point of Gaara intervening. This could also just come down to your interpretation of the lightning cloak. One thing I noticed that I haven't really heard brought up would be how when Sasuke pierces the V1A, the cloak spazzes out in all directions and Sasuke's Chidori gets weirdly enlarged, being larger than his body entirely. This could imply that the Chidori, being lightning, kind of just went through it because exactly that. However, we do know that the cloak responds primarily to force, such as when he liar bombs Sasuke, so the sheer force, the Rasengan, and its violently rotating nature, I probably wouldn't doubt if it simply just overpowers A and the lightning cloak entirely. If you're still unconvinced or uncomfortable at the idea of Jiraiya beating him for whatever reason, then he definitely beats him with Frog Song, though he could only use that one time to the summit, as Ma and Pa's vocal cords get seriously taxed after utilizing it a single time. So if you think he needs it here, then he could use it. Otherwise, he'll just use it later, where he couldn't if he still uses it here, you know what I'm saying? So yeah, I believe that since I laid out, it's more accurately to say that he passes without it, so I'm just going to move forward with that idea in mind. But again, to remind you guys, he doesn't need to blast A's head off or kill him, just corner him to a point where Gaara would intervene with his sand, changing the battle over to Sage Jiraiya versus Gaara, Kankuro, and Temari. Also bro, Kankuro and Temari, we can't act like they're actually going to do anything better than Darui or C. While I do think they might do a little better than C, it's still, well, it's like nothing, because all they have is like the ambiguity of their power, right? Because in the summit, all they do is attack similarly to Laser Circus. Temari stated in the last guidebook in reference to her time in the war during the combo attack against the base Raikage to possess the strongest wind style in all of Tsunegakure. And while this could imply it's above Gaara's sand because it's never really specified what element his sand actually is, but this is not only a bit too edgy for me to say, as this is War Arc Temari, not Kage Summit Temari, and all Kankuro has would be in the second fan book. It states that he's the best puppet user, but I mean, what other puppet users are there to compare him to? Sasori's dead, Chio's dead, you get the point. Jiraiya is basically one-shotting them, likely in a combo attack that he used against Pain in conjunction with Ma and Pa, where he would probably just like overpower them or what they could even try to use. And it's also just incredibly viable, as it could deal with all of them at once. He could also just, summon Mr. Gamaken to then relocate him around like he did in the Rain Towers, which would also just allow for him to collapse the room like Sasuke did. If anything, he could just use like Mr. Gamaken and fire his flame bombs off and kind of seep through the ceiling and summon Gamaken back to his new location, and then kind of move towards the actual summit room. And while I may seem like I'm just jumping to conclusions, to what Gaara could actually do is kind of unknown. All we really have for this Gaara, prior to the war arc is, well, he can intercept a V2 Raikage's leg drop, which is just likely much slower on the basis that Sasuke could react to it much easier than the other attacks, but more importantly, we also just don't know where the sand came from. Therefore, we can't quantify its speed in relation to A's leg drop. Deidara also outsped him pretty bad through their basic, basically through their entire battle. So if you want to be generous to him and say he's as fast as A, then just copy and paste that section, except Gaara doesn't have a lightning cloak, so Jiraiya should just slap him in the face with their Rasengan like he would have done to A. Now, just prior to getting into our interesting matches, I want to point out that yes, Jiraiya will face Mifune, who basically doesn't do much and is seemingly slower or relative to a 3-Tomoe Sharingan Sasuke, who's extremely drained of the drawbacks of the MS by this point. So, if anything, it's likely a weaker Sasuke, leaving me to simply conclude that, well, whether it's from either Ma or Pa, they should be able to combat him quickly enough for Jiraiya to still assess the situation of both Mei and Ohnoki, who are, well, of a greater threat, being both Kage in their own right. And for basically any of the leaders here, you could chop it up to say, well, they are at the peak of the peak, in terms of shinobi, but are simply outmatched against even higher level shinobi like Sage Jiraiya. But in Mifune's case, the weekly release statement isn't even valid, seen as he's neither a shinobi or a Kage at large, so Jiraiya should just be dismissing him off rip, and that really shouldn't come to a surprise. And while many people would simply assert the same thing for Mei and say that she could, might just be able to simply dismiss her in one attack, probably just don't understand the full capacity of Mei. And while, yes, she is weaker comparatively to the other Kage, her lava style is still able to blast Sasuke through the wall and into a smaller corridor in a strategy where she did that to seal the meeting room off with her lava, to then up the pH level of the corridor to then burn Sasuke and his Susanoo, which is a feat only ever replicated again by Kaguya, attesting to Mei's jutsu prowess, and, well, how effective these strategies actually can be. The corrosive acid mist is actually able to be utilized just out of her mouth, as she does melt Zetsu's point blank, and while they do try to steal her chakra here, they also did the same to Mifune and his guards, and the Zetsu were kind of just restraining them. Yet here's Mei just melting their faces off. Mei's problem most directs from her actual physical scaling, as while I would concede she could win in the ninjutsu clashes and perform valid strategies to catch Jiraiya lacking, she simply doesn't have the physical backing through things like speed for me to actually give her the win. Her only real showings are on Sasuke when he's so fatigued that he's stumbling around and dropping to his knees, sweating, talking about his pain, and even Kari notes how Sasuke's chakra is weakening, which is a verbatim sign of his physical power as well, since, well, Tobirama explains the Sharingan and equates the darker and colder the chakra to a greater power, and less of such would be a weaker power. Just prior to trying to up his Susanoo in the MS, he was able to then dodge Mei's lava style and only his 3-Tomoe from behind the back. Therefore, Mei's physical speed, being able to, put up with these high level jutsu or just aren't really that sufficient, or at least sufficient enough, coupled with the idea that how Jiraiya, at least in Sage mode, is mainly a taijutsu based fighter, seeing as the only real times he chose to utilize his ninjutsu was to divert the, path's attention and, more importantly, their vision. So I definitely could foresee a very similar strategy here for Jiraiya, to simply use his flame bombs to then distract or cover her vision, and use his superior speed simply seeping through another angle of the wall, or even just shrinking himself into a toad to then pop back out and slam her in the back with, back of the head with like a big ball or Rasengan, presuming he would even need such an attack. When I think for her, he actually could just use something like the Art of the Raging Lion's Mane that he used on the animal path in base, or the toad oil bombs, and then maybe like a fire style jutsu to combo that to put her down. And all this is much more likely when you consider that Jiraiya not only has a Sage mode stacked on top of those abilities, but an even greater Sage mode through more nature energy, which is stated to boost your ninjutsu. So they're going to be much faster, much stronger by quite the degree. So some of you might actually be wondering about Chojuro, and the reason why I haven't really brought him up is, well, he's going to be much weaker than base Jiraiya, who's, above Kakashi, and the only point in the series where the Mist Village is implied to be a similar military might to Konoha is after the pain attack, and I mean, I could assume why you could guess why someone like Jiraiya, who has a reputation so far and wide of possessing jutsu that made other shinobi tremble, the man who fought Hanzo in the Second War, who was probably the most dominant figure to ever live. The reason I bring this up is because, well, Chojiro's powers implied more so in the data books to be correlating, to like his self-confidence, and well, his confidence wasn't at its best against Sasuke because Sasuke once beat Zabuza. So I could assume how you could kind of realize how he's much more scared to fight somebody like Jiraiya, meaning he'd also just perform much worse. And what's he actually going to try to do? Like hit him with the hammer, and wish Jiraiya could just cover himself in his hair to protect himself and then follow up something like Kabari Senbon, which is stated to be his fastest and widest range attack in Sage Mode. And since both Mei and Chojiro likely will be singled out, anything Jiraiya usually tries to utilize on Mei could just also crossfire and kill Chojiro, seeing as how large the sheer difference is in power between them. The reason I say he'd single the two out is because when faced with multiple formidable opponents, i.e. Pain, he also just kind of ran through the corridors to single the paths out individually to then use the flame bomb strategies from earlier, which were successful on even the paths of Pain, and this might be detrimental seeing as Mei also tried to seal Sasuke into the hallway to make it a 1v1, this being her first strategy and one Jiraiya is known to utilize in a situation like this. So they will likely just be in the hallway corridors, which gives Jiraiya not only the advantages of the flame bombs and everything else, but he also could just use, more viable things that accounting for his much faster and stronger taijutsu to then just kick her in the eyes like he did on the animal pass, sending her flying, for him to then close the distance where he could follow up with the Sage Art Bath of Bathing Oil Jutsu that he uses in tandem with Ma and Pa, and this would have been quite critical for even the human path, seen as it was literally steaming and barely standing up after, and wouldn't have been able to do such if it weren't for the Preta Path's intervention to then absorb the jutsu, which is an ability neither Mei nor Chojiro possessed anything similar to, meaning that using either the strategy or many of the numerous strategies I mentioned earlier, Jiraiya certainly comes out on top of the battle to then battle Ohnoki and his aide Akatsuchi, who does, well, nothing. Like Jiraiya might just like turn him into a toad or whatever. Before entering though, I actually want to preface what I think Jiraiya is going to do, and that's Frog Song. Frog Song is an auditory genjutsu used by both Ma and Pa in conjunction to create the most powerful genjutsu. The downside would be its charge time, and the reason why this wouldn't really matter is after Jiraiya enters the corridors to single the paths out, he discusses his strategies quite openly and notes several factors like their vision and their separate abilities, yet states he's definitely confident in taking them one-on-one, where then Pa just pops the suggestion of Frog Song on the basis that Pain doesn't have any knowledge of it. Neither will the Kage, and though yes he would just be kicking around Mei, with the caliber of the Kage and his lack of using it thus far, he could simply charge it up against Mei and Chojiro, or even slightly before that where he even has to enter, so then he just has it prepped and ready to use on Ohnoki. From what he knows, Danzo wasn't ever very formidable and was always below Hiruzen, as he himself conceded, and we also know that he would have lost to Hiruzen in a fight as he did for the Hokage title according to the Sakura Hiden novel, meaning that Ohnoki, from what we know or what Jiraiya knows, is the last opponent he needs to face, and Frog Song is the easiest way to do that. Jiraiya should also just be aware of Ohnoki's arsenal, as he did battle in both the second and third wars, and Ohnoki was a very prominent figure in both, and was likely most infamous for his ability to vaporize anything on a molecular level via particle style. And yes, if Jiraiya were to get hit, then yeah, he'd die. But since we just, he has Frog Song, he's going to use it off rip or off start, then I just say he'd also just, pass against Ohnoki and Akatsuchi. Maybe you think he needs a little more time to charge it, in which he could potentially just blast out fire style into the particle style to make it then detonate like it does in the Boruto anime. So yes, Ohnoki would typically give Jiraiya the hardest challenge, but in this case, it's a good style matchup, at least in this scenario, meaning that he moves on to Danzo. And discussing Danzo and his aides, Fu and Torne, is basically the same for Jiraiya as it was in my Orochimaru video, and I don't want to just redundantly tell the same story or whatever, so yeah, I'm just going to sum it up like this. While Fu and Torne are quite powerful, being able to hold off Obito for a brief period of time, throw kunai faster than he could punch, decipher Kamui faster than anyone else ever, and even force him to rip his own arm off, these things are all very impressive showings. However, probably won't be able to be transferred over to Jiraiya, seeing as unlike Obito, he has a lot of really long distance ninjutsu to utilize on these two that are actually very powerful. He could just utilize Ma and Pa, two Sage Mode level fighters, to help him, meaning he could hastily move towards Danzo, who wasn't really able to put up much of a fight, seeing as, well, his only real solid showings on Sasuke is when he's much more fatigued and weaker at the beginning of the battle, where he had to die 4 times in the duration it took him to get a single attack off. A single attack that Sasuke tanked, no less, and Jiraiya, who's in Sage mode, a form that's highlighted to amplify durability. I really just don't see why they would be able to cause Jiraiya any issue. Taking him down several times really won't be like an issue. He has typical Rasengan, flaming Rasengans, big ball Rasengans, Art of the Raging, Lion's Maid, oil bombs, and now, like with that, he could also just use like his summons, like the strongest Toad, Gamabunta, that then crush Danzo, or even just aid Jiraiya a massive shot of Toad oil for them to do, just to, ignite it in flames, engulfing the entire bridge at large. Even if the Baku comes out, he just has answers through that, like this mud swamp and stuff. So, bro, like, what is there to say? Danzo's not weak, that's for sure, but he's also just nowhere near as strong as Sage Jiraiya, plus Ma and Pa, but, hey, what do I know? This is only my job. So what do you guys think? Do you guys think that Jiraiya is, he does much better? Maybe he does much worse? Did I change your mind? Well, make sure to let me know in the comments below. And please, again, maybe consider dropping a like or leaving a sub, as it would be much appreciated. And yeah, you probably enjoyed the video if you're watching this far. And again, I would totally recommend the Orochimaru rendition of this video. It's also quite informative, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. And it will be linked down below. But yeah, have a fantastic day. God bless, and as always, love you guys.